Welcome back to the car review, guys. Today we are behind the wheel of this GMC Sierra 1500 with the 5.3. Those who have been watching my channel know that I haven't been able to figure out what engine this has. We are now able to confirm it is the 5.3 liter, and this thing is so cool. So let's talk about it a little bit, talk about how I wound up with this thing for a little while, and let's talk about how I feel about it after driving it for almost a month. So right away, we're going to talk about the power plant. Like I said, this is, of course, the 5.3 liter iron block Vortec V8 from GM. This engine is actually very heavily related to the LS platform. The LS platform is pretty much just an aluminum block variant of the Vortec engines, ranging in displacement from the 5.3 LS4, which is meant for transverse mounted engines, all the way up to, I believe, a 7 liter in the LS7. So these engines are very similar to what you would find in, say, a Corvette or a GTO or even some Camaro models. So it's a really cool engine platform, to say the least. The Vortec is by far the most popular truck platform due to all of its similarities to the LS platforms. And by far, out of all the trucks I've driven so far, which have been a handful, really, I haven't driven a lot of trucks. I've driven this Sierra 1500, I've driven a Ram 1500 with the 5.7 liter Hemi V8, as well as my own Sport Track, and I prefer this by far. This is actually the spec I prefer when it comes to pickup trucks, is a single cab V8 with a regular or short bed configuration. And this one, I believe, is the regular bed. I mispronounced it and said short bed. Misdescribed it in the original unveiling video and said it was a short bed. I believe this is actually a regular bed. So it is still a normal size truck bed, but on a single cab platform. I've always said if I replace the Sport Track with another truck, which is highly unlikely, that it would more than likely be a pickup truck like this. Single cab, regular or short bed V8. And I honestly I love this thing. I really do. I honestly don't want to give it back to the guy that I borrowed it from, my cousin. And I genuinely enjoy it. The platform is what I've wanted in a truck. My original decision was to get a GM platform truck before I got the Sport Track. And so, honestly, if I were gonna buy another truck, this is what I would buy. Is something like this. More specifically, I would shoot for either an early 2000 Silverado, a like 2000 or 2001 model, or a Cat Eye Plus. And I unfortunately don't have that kind of money. Trucks, for some reason where I live, are expensive, and it's a portion of why if I replace the Sport Track and it gets totaled, I will not be replacing it with a pickup truck. Speaking of, I'm getting a text right now saying that they're just now putting the Sport Track on the lifts. And I should know what's going on by this weekend. So, for those who want an update, you get it in the middle of a car review, and that guy's got his high beams on in broad daylight. So, anyway, the Sierra 1500. Let's talk about it a little bit. This truck is, of course, a 5.3, like I said. It is, I believe, a 4L60 platform. So, you know, the good old 4L60, you know, not the greatest transmission to ever exist, but nonetheless, it is okay. And it drives great. I've only seen like a couple weird stutters out of the transmission, and thankfully due to this truck's lower mileage, this truck has 143,000 miles. It drives fairly okay. I haven't really noticed a lot of problems with how it drives. It has got me a couple of scares, which I'll get into in a minute, but otherwise, as far as the drivetrain goes, it drives really well. It feels great. It's smooth. It's got plenty of power. Like, I have yet to floor in this truck, and I'm not going to do it because I promised my cousin that I would not drive this thing hard. They know how I drive. They know I have a bit of a lead foot for acceleration, and they know, they were like, hey, take it easy on it. Just kind of drive it like you would any other car that's not yours. So that's exactly what I do. For those who don't know, I drive cars pretty much how the owner wants me to drive it. If the owner is like, hey, drive it like you stole it, I'll go for it. But if I'm driving, you know, something like this, or like my mom's Equinox or my dad's Mustang, for example, I have caught a little bit of flack for not driving my dad's Mustang hard in that review. I don't drive it hard. If they don't tell me to drive it, if they don't explicitly say drive it hard, I won't drive it hard. So that's what we're gonna do in this video. This video is pretty much just gonna be kind of a, you know, giving my thoughts on the platform as a whole and how I feel about driving one. So as far as the driving characteristics, I will say it does feel heavier than the Sport Track. You can tell pretty quickly that it is wider. I meant to say wider, not heavier. it's definitely wider. I mean, it's not a very narrow truck. It is actually really wide. So for someone like me who's really driven narrow cars my entire adult life, driving the Sport Track, for example, which isn't very wide, to the Equinox and even the Mustang, which are all very narrow cars, it is a bit of a jump to go for something this wide. And it took me a little bit at first to get used to, because of the fact that, you know, I'm used to driving a lot more narrow cars, having a little bit of wiggle room in the lane, where this does not have that much wiggle room, which makes it a little more finicky to drive. Now, obviously, let's talk about the obvious thing that a lot of people are probably noticing. The gauges don't work. And that is apparently a very common problem on GMC Sierras and Silverados from this era. In fact, I work at a car wash, so I get to see a lot of cars come through. And I've seen a couple of Sierras and Silverados that have come through and had this exact same problem. It appears to be a sending unit that goes bad on the gauge cluster, which will kill the entire cluster outside of the digital parts, which is why the odometer is still accurate and I can still tell what gear I'm in. So I'm glad those two aspects work, because that would make driving this thing a nightmare. And unfortunately, to have to get around the gauge cluster not working, I've had to use Waze on my phone, which has, you know, done the job really well, but my phone battery is actually going bad, which is why it's hooked up to a charger, because my phone would probably die in this trip I'm making right now. I'm actually traveling out to go visit my girlfriend at work, because she works at a restaurant. I'm hungry, and I promised her in December that I would go visit her at work, and I never did when she worked there during December. She took a break for school, and I'm going to go today to surprise her. So yeah, if you got a lady, make sure you go see them at work. You know, it's always a nice thing to do, especially when they don't know you're coming, which is exactly what's going on right now. But all in all, like, outside of the gauge cluster and the, of course, it wouldn't be a Roof's Tires vehicle to drive if it didn't have functioning air conditioning. And that is exactly what's going on here. This truck also does not have functioning air conditioning. So that is a very fun thing to not have, especially living in Georgia in the very beginning stages of summer. Like right now, I am burning up in this thing, and I would put the windows down, but the audio quality just goes just completely drops if I open these windows up. And so far, though, I really enjoy how this truck drives. It is smooth. It's definitely a more cruiserish type of vehicle stock. Now, I know what these trucks are capable of. I have seen the videos of turbo 5.3s or supercharged 5.3s and 6.0s and stuff mopping the floor with many cars. And I know for a fact that this truck, with the right parts, would demolish everything in its path. Now, of course, this not being my truck, don't expect to see any mod videos like that on the channel. This thing is going to stay stock because it's not mine, and I fully intend on giving it back to him in this state. I'm not going to modify a car that's not mine. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But the ride is smooth. I would say it does have its moments. You hit a pothole, you feel the pothole. It's not like the Equinox, which absorbs like bumps and, like, you know, potholes and stuff fairly well. This has a lot of creaks and rattles compared to the Equinox and to other cars I've driven and ridden in. So it can be a bit rough around the edges when you drive this thing, when it comes to ride quality. However, the basic suspension geometry is very smooth and very soft. I don't bounce around a lot. The Sport Track tends to be a bit bouncy. This does not. The Equinox does not. The Mustang does not. A lot of more modern vehicles, even though this is probably only a couple years newer than the Sport Track and has a very similar suspension setup, is just fairly smooth. Now, that may be attributed to the fact that Sport Track has 20s on it and is running 45 width tires, or not 45 width, but 45, you know, sidewalls, whereas this is running, you know, a much meatier tire. That may attribute that to a lower Titan. That looks great. So yeah, I mean, this truck just feels great. I love how it drives. It's got plenty of power. It sounds good. I just like it. I really do. And like I said, if I replace the Sport Track with another truck, which again is very unlikely, I would look very hardly into getting one of these. I would look very, 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 very hard at trying to find one. But the problem is, trucks in general where I live are expensive. Even replacing the Sport Track with another Sport Track isn't going to happen because of how expensive they've gone up. Because I only want a Gen 2 V8 to replace my Gen 1. So obviously, that complicates things because Gen 2 V8s are absurdly expensive, and the ones that are in my price range have way too many miles. Whereas other cars like GTIs and Civic SIs, stuff like that, are much better cars for the money because you get better gas mileage, more reliability, and, you know, they're a lot lower mileage cars for the price point you're paying. And Sierras and Silverados are probably the worst offenders in terms of cost when it comes to getting a truck for a decent price. Most of the time, people who want these for their first cars, they're getting 200,000+ mile trucks. You're not gonna find something like this with 143 or less for 10 grand or less. It's really difficult to find. As I've looked and researched, I've tried to find them, you know, in that 10 grand price range with good mileage like this one has. Even this one's a little bit higher than I would like. And that's virtually impossible. I really cannot find a Sierra that I would buy in my price range, because all I can either find are high mileage ones with V8s or low mileage V6 trucks. And the V6 is okay for being a daily driver, but for a performance platform, which is what I'd be buying one for, it isn't gonna work. The 4.3 just doesn't have the same modification, you know, spectrum that the 5.3 and up has. So, with all that said, why do I think this is the perfect recipe for a sport truck, as the title suggests? Let's talk about the history of sport trucks, though. The sport truck genre is really defined by 3 different trucks: the Ford SVT Lightning, the Silverado SS, and the Ram SRT10. Now, obviously, those 3 trucks were primarily sold in single cab, regular and short bed configurations. In fact, in the case of the F-150 Lightning, single cab was the only configuration available for it. And for trucks like the Silverado SS, I do believe an extended cab was optioned now. And with the Ram SRT10, you could get up to a quad cab in that, which made it the only sport truck to have that as an option. Now, these trucks were kind of the pinnacle of performance for those trucks at the time. They were trying to balance the idea of a muscle car and a pickup truck. So obviously they were using truck-based engines, however adding some flair that sports cars would have. For example, the Lightning had a supercharged V8 that was given to it as an idea from the Terminator Cobra from that time period, which was a supercharged 4-valve 4.6. And you had the Silverado SS, which used a 6-liter iron block engine, which is very similar to that of the LS2. And then you had, of course, the SRT10, which literally had a drop-in sports car motor, because that engine was also used in the Viper, and it just was a perfect recipe. Sport trucks really did have the best of all worlds when it came to engines. And I feel like this is the perfect recipe to build your own sport truck, because you have the 5.3, or in some rare cases, the 6.0 in these trucks, and the modification is endless. You can build a 1,000 horsepower Silverado or Sierra fairly easily, whereas building an older F-150 platform pre-Coyote is virtually impossible to get to that power level. And the Viper trucks, the Ram SRT10s, can make that as well. That's why if you're gonna build a sport truck, unless you buy a Lightning, you're probably gonna wanna build a lower end Silverado with the 5.3 and up, or, you know, obviously a Ram SRT10 if you have that kind of money to spend. This thing really does sound good. I really like how this truck sounds. Sport trucks, though, are very simple. Lowered, bigger wheels, and, you know, a good performance setup. And I think that the first truck to really get that on the head in terms of having the platform to make it happen, to be in the same tier as some of these sports and supercars that you find on the road, is the Sierra and the Silverado. That duo has the platforms and the engines to really make a name for themselves. These engines, the 5.3 and the 6.0, are both capable of insane power levels. Truck enthusiasts want to compete with stuff like GTRs and Porsches and Ferraris and stuff of that nature. You know, the 911 turbos and up, you know, that part of the supercar market. And I feel like that the Silverado and the Sierra are the best poised trucks to do that. Unless you have an SRT10 or a Lightning, you really aren't gonna have, you know, the ability to make a truck go that fast. And unless of course the lone exception being the F-150 with the Coyote, because those are just bonkers. But at the end of the day, these trucks are the basic recipes for a sport truck. They are single cab, regular and short bed available trucks, and have the platforms and history that the LS platform has proven, and the interchangeability of parts to really make a name for itself as a sport truck. So my recommendation, if you're wanting to buy a truck to build into an absolute powerhouse to compete with the likes of the F-150 Lightning, the Ram SRT10, and even other supercars and sports cars like your McLarens, your Ferraris, or your Camaros and Mustangs, it makes sense to buy a Silverado or Sierra. The platform is tried and true for many years and are probably cheaper than getting a hold of an F-150 with the Coyote engine, because good gosh, there's a platform that is expensive, it is pretty much any of the Ford V8 platforms. With all that said, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this car review. If you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content coming soon on my channel. I will have an update on the Sport Track, as you guys will now know, at the end of this week, and I'm super excited to get that to you guys. With all that said, everyone, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you guys for tuning in and listening to me ramble about these trucks. And yeah, stay tuned for more, guys. Have a good rest of your day.